Mithridates 6, the king who couldn't be poisoned. Our journey commences with Mithridates 6, the esteemed monarch of Pontus in the 1st century BCE. This formidable figure was not merely a sovereign, a military strategist, or a polyglot. He was a man consumed by an extreme case of paranoia, transforming himself into a living scientific experiment. His reign was overshadowed by an incessant dread of assassination, a fear that, to be fair, was entirely justifiable for rulers of antiquity. During that era, poison reigned supreme as the preferred method of dispatch. It was the swift, convenient, and highly fashionable choice for royal banquets. So, what course of action did Mithridates undertake? He embarked on a regimen of microdosing every conceivable lethal substance. A mere sprinkle of hemlock, a dash of arsenic, a subtle hint of belladonna, over time. He meticulously cultivated what was believed to be an almost impenetrable immunity. His personal apothecaries even formulated a legendary panacea known as the Mithridatium. A universal antidote so potent that medieval physicians strived to replicate it for over a millennium. This was a man who didn't just consume food, he essentially challenged it to try and harm him. However, the relentless advance of Rome altered the equation. The Romans held no regard for his elaborate scientific endeavor, their sole objective was the annexation of Pontus. Following a series of brutal skirmishes, Mithridates found himself cornered, betrayed, encircled, and on the brink of capture. The proud king, unwilling to grant his adversaries the satisfaction of parading him in chains through the streets of Rome, reached for his trusted companion, the poison. Yet, to his astonishment, nothing happened. After years of meticulously inoculating himself against death, he was, in fact, immune to its silent, elegant embrace. He had, in essence, outmaneuvered his own exit strategy. Much like a culinary expert who couldn't be burned or a fish that had forgotten how to drown. With the Romans breaching the palace gates, he turned to one of his mercenaries and, in a moment of grim irony, declared, "All right, plan B. Let's do this the old-fashioned way." And so, the king who had defied the most insidious of toxins met his end through a simple, conventional sword thrust. Sometimes, death requires no ingenuity, only consistent application. Mithridates is immortalized as the man who couldn't be vanquished by chemical means but was susceptible to the blade, just like any other mortal. It's almost a poetic twist of fate. A stark reminder that even the most meticulous preparations can be thwarted by an unforeseen, rusty blade lurking nearby. Sigurd the Mighty. The Beheaded Head's Revenge. Our next extraordinary account features a Viking, and as is customary with all compelling Viking sagas, it encompasses beheadings, audacious bravado, and a rather peculiar form of dental retribution. Allow me to introduce Sigurd Eysteinsson, more famously known as Sigurd the Mighty. A Norse earl who governed the Orkney Islands during the 9th century. He was a formidable warrior, fiercely proud of his conquests, and evidently not one for subtlety. Sigurd harbored an intense rivalry with a Scottish nobleman named Mael-Brigg the Buck-Toothed, a truly authentic moniker that will, unsettlingly, become highly relevant. Weary of their perpetual antagonism, Sigurd challenged Mael-Brigg to a battle, with each agreeing to bring 40 men. However, in quintessential Viking fashion, Sigurd resorted to deceit, arriving with 80. The odds were stacked overwhelmingly against Mael-Brigg, resulting in a total massacre. Amidst the chaos, Sigurd personally decapitated Mael-Brigg. In a brazen act that can only be described as excessive, he fastened the severed head to his saddle as a grim trophy for his triumphant journey home. This is precisely where events took a calamitous turn. As Sigurd galloped across the countryside, feeling like an invincible war god, Mael-Brigg's head bounced alongside him, repeatedly striking the horse. And as destiny would have it, one of Mael-Brigg's notoriously large teeth scraped against Sigurd's leg. Just a minor scratch, seemingly inconsequential, right? Wrong. This was the 9th century, an era devoid of antibiotics, neosporin, or even rudimentary bandages. The wound rapidly became infected. Sigurd succumbed to illness, and within a matter of days, he perished. That's right. He was fatally wounded by the very tooth of a man he had already beheaded. Maelbrigt may not have emerged victorious from the battle, but he undeniably claimed triumph in the enduring grudge match. It's the kind of narrative that feels perfectly suited for a myth, a warrior penalized for his hubris, brought down by the most insignificant, ironic detail, a literal bite from the past. While Viking sagas often recount dramatic demises, fiery longships, and the curses of enraged deities, few are as poetically absurd as this one. Sigurd rode homeward, convinced of his victory. Instead, he became the punchline in one of history's most bizarre obituaries. Let this serve as a cautionary tale: even in triumph, inspect your saddle, and perhaps refrain from tethering enemy heads to your steed. One can never predict what teeth might be plotting. Pyrrhus of Epirus, the general conquered by a roof tile. Let us now turn our attention to Pyrrhus of Epirus. A military genius so adept at securing individual victories that he inadvertently forfeited entire wars merely to emphasize his point. This was no insignificant dignitary. Pyrrhus was the cousin of Alexander the Great, a strategic prodigy, and a persistent irritant to the burgeoning power of Rome. He was renowned for his Pyrrhic victories, a term coined to describe a triumph achieved at such a ruinous cost that it essentially equates to a defeat. One might as well have remained home and attended to domestic chores. After years of grueling campaigns, valorous charges, and the arduous task of cajoling elephants into obedience, Pyrrhus found himself in Argos, entangled in yet another convoluted Greek political imbroglio. It was late, and he was exhausted. Yet honor and questionable judgment compelled him to engage in one final confrontation. Thus, in the dead of night, Pyrrhus led his forces into the city. However, this was no grand, cinematic entrance. His elephants became wedged in the narrow thoroughfares, his soldiers lost their bearings, and by dawn, Pyrrhus, the formidable general, was engaged in swordplay with random adversaries in an alley, resembling a bewildered tourist in armor. Now, this is where fate sharpens its comedic pencil. From a rooftop overlooking the street, an elderly woman observed the unfolding chaos. Her name remains unknown to history, but one thing is certain: she held strong opinions and possessed a roof tile. She decided it was her moment to participate. With the unthinking precision of someone who had clearly thrown various objects before, likely at chickens, grandchildren, or other unwelcome invaders, she released the tile. A direct hit. The ceramic shingle struck Pyrrhus squarely on the head. He collapsed to the ground like a sack of overripe turnips. One of the enemy soldiers, either disoriented or opportunistic, rushed forward and delivered the finishing blow. Just like that, the man who had weathered Roman legions, Macedonian political machinations, and his own considerable ego was dispatched by a Greek grandmother and rudimentary construction material. There is no statue commemorating this woman. No official commendation for the most effective use of architectural debris in urban warfare, but in truth, there ought to be. And Pyrrhus? He became a cautionary tale. A powerful reminder that no matter the size of one's army, gravity always triumphs. Grigory Rasputin, the immortal mystic. Next on our list is Grigory Rasputin, the enigmatic Russian mystic, healer, and zealous advocate for beards, whose death has become the gold standard for sheer overkill. Rasputin posed a significant problem, not merely on a political scale but on a cosmic one. He was akin to that persistent guest at a party who simply refuses to leave, incessantly pontificates about spiritual visions, and has somehow mesmerized the host's wife and all her acquaintances. Except, in this scenario, the host was Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, and the party was a crumbling monarchy. Naturally, the Russian aristocracy desired his immediate removal. Their initial attempts were polite, but Rasputin was not a man of subtlety, so they escalated to murder. Plan A: poison. They prepared a cake for him, infusing it with enough cyanide to decimate an entire village. Rasputin consumed it, smiled, and requested more. At this point, someone undoubtedly began to perspire, so they proceeded to Plan B. Shoot him. They shot him in the chest. Rasputin collapsed. Success. They leaned in to confirm. A grave error. He sat upright like a villain from a horror film and began to shout. This was undoubtedly the moment when someone shrieked and dropped a glass. So, Plan C, shoot him again, multiple times. He fell once more, but still, he wasn't quite finished. Rasputin then proceeded to crawl across the floor, allegedly attempting to escape the palace. Because why not? Bullets had never deterred him before. By now, the assassins were rapidly running out of options. So, they bound him, dragged him to the river, and unceremoniously tossed him into the frozen Neva, purely for good measure, of course. And here lies the final, shocking twist. When his body was recovered downstream, his hands were reportedly clutching at the ice, implying he was still alive underwater, desperately striving to break free. Because, naturally, he was. It required poison, gunfire, blunt force trauma, and drowning to finally bring about Rasputin's demise. If they had attempted to stab him with garlic or drive a stake through his heart, no one would have even batted an eye. So, what invaluable lesson do we glean from this? Never underestimate a man with questionable hygiene, dubious theological beliefs, and skin seemingly crafted from iron. Chrysippus of Soli. Laughter as a fatal prescription. Our next peculiar departure from life comes courtesy of Chrysippus of Soli, a distinguished Stoic philosopher from ancient Greece who dedicated his existence to the profound contemplation of logic, ethics, and, it would appear, the peculiar habits of livestock. Stoic philosophers were renowned for their grave demeanor, advocating for emotional restraint, rational thought, and the enduring of hardship with unwavering resolve. Yet, Chrysippus, remarkably, departed this world amidst peals of laughter, quite literally. One afternoon, while engaged in whatever activities ancient philosophers pursued between their lectures, likely pacing dramatically in a toga, Chrysippus observed something rather peculiar, a donkey partaking of figs. That, in its entirety, was the scene. However, Chrysippus, clearly in a whimsical mood, turned to a servant and instructed, "Provide that donkey with a drink of wine to wash down the figs." And in that precise moment, it transpired. He began to laugh, and he simply could not cease. Not a polite chuckle, not a philosopher's knowing smirk, but a full-blown, chest-rattling, wheezing, gasping, tear-inducing fit of laughter that ultimately culminated in his death. Yes. The man who could expound for hours on the very nature of the universe died because he found the notion of a donkey consuming fruit and sipping wine too ludicrous to endure. To be unequivocally clear, this was not the first instance of ancient Greek philosophers meeting bizarre ends. One reputedly choked on a fig, another tumbled into a well while engrossed in stargazing. But Chrysippus truly committed to the bit. Imagine the scenario: scholars gathered, anticipating another profound lesson in virtue, only to discover their esteemed teacher sprawled on the floor, still smiling, perhaps mid-giggle. Not precisely the legacy Plato might have envisioned. There is a beautifully ironic dimension to a Stoic, an individual whose entire existence revolved around the mastery of emotion, being undone by a singular punchline. It's akin to a fire safety instructor meeting their demise while juggling matches near a curtain. And what a legacy! People might eventually forget one's intricate theories on metaphysics. But the tale of the man who died laughing at his own donkey joke will undoubtedly be recounted for centuries. Some assert that laughter is the most effective medicine, in this particular instance. It unequivocally was not. Franz Reichelt, the tailor who fell for fashion. Let us now introduce Franz Reichelt, a man of boundless vision, unyielding ambition, and an unconventional thought. Why should only birds monopolize the joy of flight? Franz was an Austrian-born tailor residing in Paris during the early 20th century. However, his aspirations extended far beyond merely stitching suits. He yearned to stitch history. His groundbreaking concept, a wearable parachute. Indeed, Franz harbored a dream of designing a coat that could miraculously transform into wings. It was a fusion of fashion and aviation, an audacious gamble. Early aviation, at this juncture, was still a nascent and chaotic realm, characterized by aircraft resembling cumbersome kites and crashes occurring with greater frequency than successful landings. Consequently, Franz reasoned that if pilots were destined to fall, they might as well descend with style and grace. After numerous attempts, rigorous tests, and a succession of prototypes, most of which concluded with crash test dummies plummeting unceremoniously to the earth, Franz felt he was finally ready. Or, at least, he convinced himself of his readiness. Despite fervent pleas from friends and authorities to desist, he adamantly insisted on conducting the final test himself. And what grander stage for such a dramatic debut than the iconic Eiffel Tower? The year was 1912. Franz arrived amidst a flurry of media attention, proudly adorned in his flying coat. Reporters congregated, cameras rolled, and even police officers were present, primarily hoping to prevent him, but also harboring a distinct sense of curiosity. He ascended the colossal structure, offered a wave to the assembled throng below, and positioned himself on the precipice. Then, with a leap of faith, he plunged. His ingenious parachute, alas, remained resolutely closed, offering not even the slightest hint of deployment. Franz plummeted earthward like a tailor-shaped projectile, impacting the ground with a force that defied conventional speed measurements. Best described in units of sheer agony per hour. His life extinguished instantaneously, leaving in its wake a shallow crater, a crumpled coat, and an uncomfortable silence that settled heavily upon the horrified onlookers. It would have been a profoundly tragic conclusion, were it not for the exquisite irony woven into its very fabric. Here was a man who endeavored to render the act of falling safe, only to meet his end by falling himself. He departed this world engaged in his passion, inventing. Regrettably, his final prototype became inextricably linked with his final breath. And as cruelly as history often dictates, he is remembered not as a skilled tailor, nor even as an ingenious inventor, but rather as the flying tailor, a figure who aspired to touch the heavens but instead found an abrupt communion with the earth. Valerian, the emperor turned Ottoman. If the notion of being a Roman emperor conjures images of perpetual glory, an unending supply of grapes served on gleaming silver platters, then allow me to introduce you to Valerian. He holds the dubious distinction of being the sole Roman emperor ever captured in battle, subsequently undergoing a transformation into, quite literally, a piece of furniture. Valerian's reign, spanning the 3rd century CE, coincided with an era when the sprawling Roman Empire was succumbing to the relentless pressures of internal decay and external threats, much like an overcooked lasagna cracking under its own weight. Plagues ravaged the populace, civil wars tore at the empire's seams, and barbarian invasions became a grim annual tradition, truly, a period where chaos was a constant companion. Despite this relentless onslaught, Valerian valiantly strove to maintain the empire's fragile cohesion. One of his most formidable challenges stemmed from the burgeoning power of the Persians, particularly their resolute king Shapur, who harbored absolutely no tolerance for Roman grandstanding. Consequently, Valerian amassed his legions and embarked on a westward campaign, steadfastly determined to assert Roman dominance. The outcome, however, was far from favorable. In the calamitous Battle of Edessa, the Roman army was utterly annihilated, and, a true rarity for the times, Valerian was captured alive. Apprehending an emperor was akin to ensnaring a unicorn in a bear trap, an extraordinary feat. One might anticipate that Shapur would demand a substantial ransom or leverage this unparalleled capture for a diplomatic power play. Yet, Shapur entertained a far more audacious and humiliating scheme. He transformed Valerian into a literal human footstool. Indeed, whenever Shapur intended to mount his horse, the former emperor was compelled to kneel beneath his boots, a public ritual performed daily. This was not mere humiliation, it was humiliation meticulously choreographed for maximum effect. And just when the depths of degradation seemed plumbed, it worsened. After enduring years of this royal indignity, Valerian succumbed in captivity. The historical accounts diverge regarding the precise cause of his death, but the most vivid and widely circulated version claims that Shapur had him flayed, his skin stuffed with straw, and then displayed as a macabre war trophy in a Persian temple. This served as a chilling admonition to Rome and a resounding triumph for Persia. And, let's be honest, it represents a taxidermist's absolute worst day on the job. Rome, predictably, was far from pleased. They never officially acknowledged Valerian's grim fate, choosing instead to portray his disappearance as a mysterious vanishing act, perhaps implying he was merely enjoying a quiet retirement, sipping wine somewhere idyllic. Sure. However, Valerian's ignominious destiny indelibly etched itself into historical memory, a mighty emperor brought low by hubris, flawed strategy, and a king possessed of a disturbingly literal sense of humor. King Adolf Frederick, death by desert. Allow me to introduce King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. A monarch whose legacy is less defined by his national governance and more by his unfortunate demise at the hands of his own dinner. Adolf Frederick reigned during the 18th century, a period generally characterized by relative tranquility in Swedish history. He was not celebrated for instigating wars, enacting sweeping reforms, or composing profound philosophical treatises. Instead, he gained notoriety for literally eating himself to death. This was not a metaphorical, devoured by ambition, scenario, this was a bona fide, unadulterated death by buffet. It was Fat Tuesday, 1771, the final day before the commencement of Lent, a perfectly justifiable pretext for culinary indulgence. And King Adolf exhibited absolutely no restraint. According to historical chronicles, he consumed an astonishing array of delicacies: lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, copious amounts of champagne, and, most notably, 14 servings of his cherished dessert, semla. For those unfamiliar with the semla, imagine a cardamom-spiced bun, generously filled with almond paste and a cloud of whipped cream, all gently floating in warm milk. Delectable, airy, and deceptively innocuous, unless, of course, one consumes 14 of them consecutively. At which point they transform into a Viking curse in pastry form. Following this heroic culinary endeavor, the king reportedly complained of stomach pains, which, let's be candid, is the most decorous phrasing history could employ for what must have been a full-body digestive rebellion. Shortly thereafter, he passed away. The official cause of death was cited as digestive problems. In contemporary parlance, we might categorize this under fatal food regret. Swedish citizens were, understandably, aghast. One moment they possessed a king, the next he had been decisively outmaneuvered by a dessert. Not an assassin, not a rebellion, not a jewel, but cream and almonds. There is something profoundly, bizarrely poetic about it. A king indulging himself one final time, vanquished by the very luxury that epitomized his existence. The royal court undoubtedly endeavored to maintain a dignified narrative, but history remembers the menu. To this day, Sweden continues its tradition of celebrating Fat Tuesday with semla buns. And yes, every single year, someone invariably recounts the tale of the king who loved them a little too much. Diogenes of Sinope, the philosopher who held his breath. Let us now turn to Diogenes of Sinope, ancient Greece's most celebrated minimalist, incisive social critic, and consummate button-pusher. Diogenes was a philosopher of the Cynic school, which is a polite way of describing an individual who cared not a whit for societal opinion, donned the same tattered tunic daily, and resided in what was essentially a colossal clay jar. He staunchly believed in living a life unburdened by material possessions, free from social expectations, and devoid of personal shame. And he rigorously practiced what he preached, publicly, loudly, and, on occasion, rather indecently. So, how did this crusty legend meet his end? Well, ancient sources, ever unreliable. Present conflicting accounts, which is perpetually a red flag in historical narrative. However, one of the most delightfully entertaining versions asserts that Diogenes died by holding his breath. Yes, voluntarily, as in, I am utterly done with this world, I shall simply cease to inhale. Some interpret this as an ultimate act of willpower. A final mic drop in a life dedicated to the outright rejection of society. Others suspect he was merely incredibly stubborn and perhaps attempting to prove a profound point about his dominion over his own destiny. To be fair, other purported causes of his demise exist. One version claims he perished from consuming raw octopus. Another suggests he was bitten by a dog, which, given his fondness for canine metaphors, feels almost too poetically apt. But the breath-holding theory, that one has endured, likely because it so perfectly encapsulates the essence of Diogenes himself. This was a man who once ambled through the streets at high noon with a lit lantern, proclaiming he was searching for an honest man. This was the same individual who boldly instructed Alexander the Great, the most formidable man on earth, to move aside, for you are blocking my sun. So, yes. The decision to simply stop breathing because one is utterly fed up with humanity aligns perfectly with his established brand. And the most remarkable aspect? People respected it. The very society he mocked, challenged, and unequivocally rejected ultimately honored him with a public tomb. It appears that being a curmudgeon with an endless supply of pithy one-liners ensures lasting remembrance. Diogenes died as he lived, dramatically, eccentrically, and entirely on his own terms. Marcus Licinius Crassus, a golden demise. Now we arrive at Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man whose immense wealth rendered other Roman millionaires akin to part-time pottery vendors. Crassus was not merely rich, he was obscenely opulent. His vast holdings included silver mines, extensive real estate, countless slaves, and even private fire brigades. Yes, he owned fire brigades, which he would dispatch to burning buildings, magnanimously offering assistance only if the beleaguered property owner first agreed to sell him the blazing edifice. A true Roman real estate shark. Yet, his ambitions transcended mere financial accumulation, he yearned for something more than gold, he coveted glory. He had already amassed a staggering fortune. Now he desired to be remembered alongside luminaries like Caesar or Pompey, as a man who had conquered something far grander than a mere tax loophole. Thus, in 53 BCE, Crassus made the fateful decision to invade Parthia, Rome's affluent eastern neighbor. Envision it as Rome's equivalent of, "Hold my wine, I've got this." The ensuing campaign was an unmitigated disaster. He woefully underestimated the Parthians, who possessed terrifyingly skilled archers, expert cavalry, and absolutely no inclination to be subjugated. Crassus marched his army deep into the unforgiving desert, directly into a meticulously laid trap. Thousands of Roman soldiers were massacred. His own son was killed, and morale disintegrated faster than a Roman aqueduct during a budget cut. Eventually, Crassus himself was captured. The Parthians were well aware of his identity. They had heard the legends. The wealthiest man in Rome, a man utterly consumed by his obsession with riches, practically a walking coin purse. So, as a parting gesture, they executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat. You read that correctly. The richest man in Rome met his end by choking on liquid wealth. It was less an execution and more a macabre performance piece, a brutal theatrical message. You desired gold? Here, consume it all, right down to your lungs. Some dismiss this account as mere myth. Others contend it is an exaggeration. But even if the precise details of his death are apocryphal, the story itself spread like wildfire throughout Rome. And that is the peculiar nature of history. Sometimes it favors poetic justice over mundane truth. Crassus's golden demise became a potent cautionary tale, not merely about insatiable greed, but about unchecked hubris. About flying perilously close to the sun while clutching a bag of coins. Spartacus, the gladiator who fought to the last breath. If you have ever uttered the phrase, "I am Spartacus," be aware that behind the iconic meme and cinematic moment lies the narrative of a man who quite literally fought until no one remained standing, including himself. Spartacus was not born a hero. He began his life as a Thracian soldier, subsequently captured by the Romans and cast into the brutal, unforgiving crucible of gladiator schools, institutions that bore less resemblance to a Hogwarts for fighters and more to daily beatings punctuated by occasional rations of bread. He trained. He endured, and then, he rebelled. In 73 BCE, alongside approximately 70 fellow gladiators, Spartacus orchestrated a daring escape. Employing kitchen knives and whatever implements were not permanently affixed. Within mere weeks, they had vanquished Roman patrols and amassed thousands of runaway slaves and social outcasts. What began as a desperate flight rapidly escalated into a full-blown slave uprising, erupting directly in the heartland of Rome's imperial pride. For 2 tumultuous years, Spartacus led this improbable rebel army. They consistently defeated trained legions, repeatedly humiliated Roman generals, and sowed widespread panic within the hallowed halls of the Senate. And throughout it all, Spartacus adamantly refused to be relegated to a mere historical footnote. He wasn't merely escaping, he was actively fighting back. However, the Romans, unsurprisingly, do not tolerate prolonged humiliation. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus, yes, the very Crassus from our previous chapter. Of the molten gold throat notoriety, who was tasked with quelling the rebellion before it blossomed into a full-scale revolution. Eventually, Spartacus and his formidable army found themselves cornered in southern Italy. Outnumbered, surrounded, with dwindling supplies and no viable escape route, Spartacus refused to surrender. Instead, he did what Spartacus always did, he fought. According to ancient accounts, he surged directly toward Crassus himself, carving a path through legionaries like a man with absolutely no intention of a quiet retirement. He was wounded, reportedly stabbed multiple times. Yet he relentlessly continued his advance until he vanished amidst the tumultuous clash of battle. His body was never recovered. No triumphal Roman parade. No captured king brought in chains to the steps of the Senate, he was simply gone. And yet, his narrative endured. Rome crucified over 6,000 of his followers along the Appian Way as a chilling warning. However, they could not expunge the undeniable truth that a man who began with merely kitchen knives had come perilously close to shattering the very pride of their empire. Spartacus did not simply perish. He steadfastly refused to fall. And that particular kind of ending reverberates with a far louder echo than any emperor's throne. Lucius Junius Brutus Damasippus, the general with a sarcastic exit. In the tumultuous twilight years of the Roman Republic, an era when senators routinely plotted over shared goblets of wine and civil conflicts erupted during mere lunch breaks, one name briefly ignites before fading into a spectacular demise. Lucius Junius Brutus Damasippus. Now, Damasippus was hardly a household name, but he was a Roman general and an unwavering adherent of Marius, one half of the infamous Marius versus Sulla rivalry. Picture it as Rome's version of a political debate, except instead of microphones, everyone wielded swords and commanded backup legions. When Sulla returned from the east with his hardened, battle-forged army, Rome braced for the inevitable impact. Damasippus, fiercely loyal to the now-defeated Marians, was apprehended during Sulla's brutal purge of his adversaries, a political spring cleaning, albeit one involving significantly more bloodshed and considerably fewer dustpans. He was condemned to execution alongside a handful of other high-profile captives. But this is precisely where Damasippus carves out his unique niche on our list. As he and the others were being led to their deaths, one of the condemned men began to sob uncontrollably, desperately pleading for his life. In a moment of sheer, almost bewildered exasperation, Damasippus turned to him and, with a laugh, quipped, "Why weep, fool? Did you not know what business we came here for?" And that was it. No groveling, no last meal request. Just a mordant one-liner and a composed stride toward the waiting blade. It's the kind of reaction that unequivocally screams, "I've already perused the script, and I see no need for a rewrite." In an age where final pronouncements could be poetic, utterly desperate, or brimming with regret, Damasippus opted for dry sarcasm. He confronted death as if it were nothing more than a tedious committee meeting, a minor inconvenience, certainly not something worth sacrificing one's dignity over. Was he a military titan? Perhaps not. Did he alter the course of history? No. But he exited with a degree of composure that surpassed most emperors, kings, or even philosophers. And sometimes, in the annals of history, that is more than sufficient. He faced the inevitable end not with trepidation but with a shrug, a witty remark, and impeccable timing. Caligula, the Emperor of Chaos. If history were to compile a most likely to be assassinated by lunchtime yearbook, Caligula would undoubtedly grace its cover, resplendent in a full laurel crown. Perpetually smiling. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he initially showed immense promise. The Roman populace adored him, and the legions revered him. He was the offspring of a renowned war hero, raised amidst the grandeur of the imperial palace. For a brief period in 37 CE, he appeared to be Rome's golden boy. Then, quite spectacularly, his sanity utterly disintegrated. Caligula's reign rapidly devolved into a waking nightmare of intense paranoia, rampant delusion, and governance that bordered on performance art. He audaciously proclaimed himself a deity, demanding worship accordingly, and famously elevated his horse, Incitatus, to the rank of senator. To be fair, the equine senator never actually graced a session. But he did possess a lavish marble stable, a jewel-encrusted collar, and, by all accounts, exhibited far better table manners than most members of the Senate. Caligula capriciously executed senators for merely blinking suspiciously, declared war on Poseidon, yes, the god of the sea, and once commanded his entire army to collect seashells as war trophies. This was not merely madness, it was a form of spectacularly creative madness. Eventually, even his most loyal guards grew weary of constantly sidestepping his daily caprices. His behavior was entirely unpredictable, his punishments theatrically extreme, and Rome had grown exhausted of being governed by a man who considered reality to be an optional construct. Consequently, in 41 CE, a cabal of conspirators, led by disaffected members of the Praetorian Guard, his very own security detail, decided it was time for a dramatic performance of their own. They cornered him in a dimly lit corridor beneath the palace. There were no lengthy speeches, no poetic farewells, just a furious flurry of stabbings. Many stabbings. One historical source suggests that over 30 wounds were inflicted. That was not merely an assassination, it was a vehemently worded group project. His body was unceremoniously dumped into a shallow grave. No honors, no state funeral, just the abrupt end of a man who once attempted to replace statues of the gods with statues of himself. And yet, Caligula remains etched in memory, not for wisdom or reform, but for transforming Rome into a chaotic circus and ruling it like a fever dream. He died as dramatically as he lived, surrounded by blades. Betrayed by his inner circle, and likely thinking, my horse could have managed this place with more competence. And honestly, he might have been entirely correct. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, drowned in wine. Few historical figures can boast a death as strangely specific and distinctly wine-themed as that of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. If the name resonates, it's because George was unequivocally at the epicenter of England's most turbulent family feud, the Wars of the Roses. Imagine a 15th-century version of Game of Thrones. Albeit with a greater abundance of velvet hats and a distinct scarcity of dragons. George was the younger brother of King Edward IV and the elder brother of Richard III, yes, that Richard III. For a period, George found himself directly in line for the throne. Regrettably, George possessed two fatal flaws: boundless ambition and a complete absence of self-preservation. He defected between warring factions in the Civil War on multiple occasions, perpetually plotting rebellions, aligning himself with whichever side appeared most formidable that particular week, and acquiring new enemies with the efficiency of a medieval tax collector. Eventually, King Edward, utterly exasperated by George's incessant backstabbing, sometimes quite literally, had him arrested for treason. Now, Edward confronted a dilemma. How does one execute one's own brother without provoking a public relations disaster? The solution arrived in the form of the most peculiar royal death in English history. According to chroniclers, George was extended a choice regarding the manner of his demise, and he purportedly selected being drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. Allow that image to fully sink in. Not the gallows, not the axe. Not even a respectable poisoning. A barrel, brimming with wine, as if he intended his obituary to declare, died doing what he loved. Was this poetic justice, a grim irony? Or merely a morbid joke that spiraled out of control? Historians continue to debate whether this event actually transpired or if it was a satirical embellishment appended later. However, the image has endured, and honestly, even if it is exaggerated, it feels perfectly aligned with Clarence's character, messy, extravagant, and mildly preposterous. He was interred in Westminster Abbey. Presumably stone-cold sober by that point, and largely forgotten, save for the rather splashy nature of his exit. So, if you ever feel that your family suffers from excessive drama, just remember. At least no one has been accused of treason, condemned to death by wine barrel, and transformed into England's most potable cautionary tale. Now, that's a truly vintage ending. Archimedes. The genius undisturbed. To conclude our exploration of legendary departures, we arrive at a tale that starkly demonstrates how even the most brilliant intellect offers no defense against abysmal timing. We speak of the demise of Archimedes, the preeminent mind of ancient Greece, tragically felled by an individual who harbored absolutely no regard for geometry. Archimedes was a prodigious mathematician, an innovative engineer, and a pioneering inventor, essentially, the kind of individual who could casually observe a puddle and, in doing so, unravel the fundamental principles of fluid mechanics. He conceived of levers, pulleys, formidable war machines, and once, it is famously recounted, defended the city of Syracuse using colossal mirrors that concentrated sunlight to set Roman ships ablaze. Whether that last detail is entirely accurate or not, the man's intellectual acuity was undeniable. Regrettably, what he was not, was socially aware. In 212 BCE, the Romans, after a prolonged and brutal siege, finally conquered Syracuse. Soldiers poured into the city, plundering, shouting, and relentlessly searching for enemies. And there, upon the ground, meticulously bent over a diagram drawn in the sand, was Archimedes. He was sketching, lost in profound contemplation, likely deciphering some eternal truth concerning spirals, catapults, or the precise number of camels required to fill a bath. A Roman soldier approached. Now, most individuals, upon encountering a man wielding a sword, might rise, offer a greeting, perhaps even utter a desperate plea for their life. But not Archimedes. Legend has it that he merely looked up and, with an unwavering tone, declared, "Do not disturb my circles." That was all. No supplication, no introduction, merely a firm boundary concerning his ongoing geometrical work. The soldier, either offended, utterly bewildered, or simply possessing an inherent disdain for mathematics, summarily executed him on the spot. A casual, almost bureaucratic end to one of history's most profound intellects. When the Roman general Marcellus discovered this unfortunate turn of events, he was incandescent with rage. He had issued stringent orders that Archimedes was to be spared. The man was simply too invaluable, too brilliant to be so carelessly wasted. But alas, even unparalleled brilliance is no match for a confused foot soldier with a deplorable attitude. There is a strange, almost melancholic poetry to it. Archimedes, the man who precisely calculated the volume of irregular shapes and invented the screw pump, was not defeated by a rival genius, but by someone who likely couldn't even define a hypotenuse. And so, one of history's brightest intellectual lights was extinguished mid-equation. Let this serve as a cautionary tale. If you are diligently working on a groundbreaking idea, perhaps occasionally glance upward, especially during an invasion. King Henry I of France. The royal backache. Being a monarch undoubtedly came with a plethora of advantages: opulent velvet robes, an endless supply of feasts, a private choir or two. But as King Henry I of France discovered in the 11th century, it did not include guaranteed back support. Now, Henry was not a particularly extravagant or wild ruler. He neither charged into battle bare-chested nor hosted orgies in the throne room. He was, in fact, a remarkably steady and consistent ruler. A quality that in medieval Europe rendered him practically a unicorn. He reigned from 1031 to 1060, competently managed a few standard rebellions, raised a family, and sporadically commissioned the construction of a church or two. Nothing overtly flashy. However, he will forever be remembered not for his governance, but for the rather prosaic manner of his departure. The prevailing account suggests that one day, after prolonged sitting, perhaps in devout prayer, or, more plausibly, after an exceptionally lengthy royal meeting, King Henry rose too abruptly. And that, simply, was it. He collapsed. It could have been a stroke, possibly an aneurysm. Or perhaps just gravity emphatically asserting its dominance. Whatever the precise medical cause, he died shortly thereafter. To be fair, 11th century medicine was hardly renowned for its diagnostic precision. The local physician likely waved a handful of herbs over his chest, muttered something arcane about bad humors, and promptly recommended immediate bloodletting. Spoiler alert, it proved ineffective. And thus, the King of France became one of the earliest recorded victims of what modern science might categorize as orthostatic hypotension, that peculiar head rush you experience when you stand up too quickly, causing a momentary perception of stars. Only in his case, it wasn't merely fleeting dizziness, it marked the end credits of his life. Now, one might contend that dying after simply standing up is a somewhat anticlimactic end for a king. However, consider the profound symbolism. A man who reigned for decades, navigating through wars, intricate plots, and devastating plagues, was ultimately brought down by a sudden shift in posture. It's as if history itself whispered, even kings are not immune to leg cramps. Sesshu Toyo, the monk who drew himself to death. In medieval Japan, an era where honor was frequently measured in the swiftness of sword strokes and the drama of one's final exit, Sesshu Toyo opted for a quieter, yet profoundly impactful, legacy, a legacy crafted from ink, silence, and an extraordinary wellspring of patience. Born in 1420, Sesshu was raised within the austere confines of a temple. Trained as a Zen monk, and, like the vast majority of his monastic brethren, was expected to dedicate his life to meditation, humility, and the diligent sweeping of temple grounds. Yet, Sesshu harbored a singular preoccupation. He harbored an intense, almost obsessive love for drawing, particularly when such activity was explicitly forbidden. There exists a famous anecdote that as a child, when punished and tied up for neglecting his duties, he ingeniously utilized his toe to sketch a remarkably lifelike mouse on the temple floor, so convincing, in fact, that the startled monks reportedly believed it to be real. That's right. His detention doodles possessed the power to elicit jump scares. Sesshu later embarked on a journey to China to meticulously study ink painting at its very source. Upon his return to Japan, he brought with him a style so audacious, fluid, and emotionally charged that it fundamentally transformed Japanese art forever. His landscapes appeared as though they had been breathed onto the very page, mountains seemed to hover ethereally in swirling mist, trees possessed more distinct personality than most dinner guests. He aged, his artistic focus gravitating towards the serene beauty of nature and the profound concept of emptiness, classic Zen themes. But unlike the samurai of his era, who often met their end dramatically in battle or through ritual suicide, Sesshu simply continued to paint. And when his final hour arrived, he confronted death just as he had embraced life, with a brush in hand. Legend recounts that as he lay dying in 1506, Sesshu requested ink and paper. His ultimate act was a singular, bold stroke, one final line upon the page. Simple, intense, and enigmatic. There was no signature, no accompanying explanation, just a decisive brush stroke to mark his exit, as if to convey, "This is sufficient." He did not perish in a sword fight. He did not poison himself beneath the delicate petals of a cherry tree. He simply painted until his last breath, allowing the ink to communicate what words never could. A quiet demise. Yet an epic one for those who comprehend the profound significance of leaving behind a masterpiece in silence. So, the next time life feels overwhelmingly noisy, remember Sesshu. Sometimes the final word is simply a line. Seigo Takamori, The Last Samurai. If you've ever envisioned a samurai's death as noble, cinematically dramatic, and framed by falling cherry blossoms, then Seigo Takamori is the figure your imagination was undoubtedly drawing inspiration from. Born in 1828, Seigo ascended through the ranks as a brilliant warrior, a shrewd statesman, and, ultimately, a reluctant revolutionary. He played a pivotal role in leading the Meiji Restoration, a transformative period that rapidly modernized Japan, dismantled the feudal system, and, regrettably, rendered the samurai class as obsolete as a fax machine in our contemporary smartphone-driven world. Many samurai adapted to these sweeping changes. Seigo, however, did not. As reform swept across Japan, banning swords, eliminating samurai stipends, and dismantling nearly every vestige of tradition, Seigo emerged as the quiet embodiment of widespread discontent. And in 1877, when the Satsuma Rebellion erupted, he stood unequivocally at its forefront. What was intended as a protest rapidly escalated into a full-scale war. Seigo, accompanied by a few thousand staunchly loyal warriors, marched against the imperial army, a formidable force now equipped with modern rifles, powerful artillery, and considerably fewer nostalgic ideals. For months, they fought, outnumbered, outgunned, and undeniably facing inevitable defeat. Yet, Seigo steadfastly refused to retreat. Finally, at the Battle of Shiroyama, the ultimate stand unfolded. Surrounded, gravely wounded, and witnessing his army crumble around him, Seigo turned to his remaining men. What transpired next remains a subject of historical debate. Did he commit seppuku, the ritual suicide of a samurai? Or was he too severely injured and requested a loyal follower to deliver the swift final blow? Either way, he died with his sword at his side, facing the future he had helped construct but to which he no longer belonged. Japan mourned him, then promptly elevated him to legendary status. The very government that had defeated him eventually granted him a posthumous pardon, erected statues in his honor, and began instructing schoolchildren about his inherent nobility, as if they had never aimed cannons at him in the first place. Sago became the quintessential tragic symbol, the man who valiantly fought for honor in a world that had irrevocably moved on. Sometimes, to achieve immortality, one need not win. One simply needs to lose like a legend. Jesse James, the outlaw's quiet end. Jesse James was far more than just a common outlaw, he was the very embodiment of American rebellion. The archetypal figure wielding a pistol in one hand and a train schedule in the other. Born in 1847 in Missouri, Jesse James began his infamous career as a Confederate guerrilla fighter. Notorious for robbing Union soldiers and indiscriminately burning property that was not his own. After the cessation of hostilities, he evidently reasoned, why cease now? And transitioned from a rebel into a full-fledged legend, leading the infamous James Younger gang on a decade-long crime spree of audacious bank heists, stagecoach stick-ups, and daring train robberies across the American Midwest. To the sensation-hungry newspapers of the era, he was a hero, to the banks, a living nightmare, and to most law enforcement officials. He was a walking target with a bounty so substantial it could induce profound trust issues within any social circle. This brings us to Robert Ford, Jesse's supposed friend and fellow gang member, who had recently been promised a pardon and a hefty $10,000 reward for facilitating Jesse's capture, dead or alive. In April 1882, Jesse James was discreetly living under an assumed name in St. Joseph, Missouri. Robert Ford and his brother were residing with him, akin to roommates, but with considerably more loaded weaponry and fewer personal boundaries. On the morning of April 3, Jesse, in a rare moment of vulnerability, removed his firearms and ascended a chair to dust a framed picture hanging on the wall. It was a domestic scene, perhaps a little too tranquil. Ford seized the opportunity, drew his revolver, aimed at Jesse's exposed back, and shot him in the head, mid-sentence, mid-movement, mid-dusting. The iconic legend of the Wild West tumbled from a chair, a mundane household chore left unfinished, an end that feels simultaneously epic and incredibly ordinary. Robert Ford anticipated being hailed as a hero. Instead, he was met with widespread public disdain. The public did not revere Jesse for his morality, they adored him for his audacity. And killing him in such a manner was not an act of courage, it was one of blatant convenience. Jesse James did not perish in a blaze of gunfire or a dramatic shootout, but rather, in his socks. Betrayed by a man who had been sharing his morning coffee. Sometimes, history is not a dramatic duel at high noon. Sometimes, it is simply a matter of someone turning their back and someone else succumbing to the irresistible allure of a reward. Isambard Kingdom Brunel. The engineer undone by his dream. If the name Isambard Kingdom Brunel is unfamiliar, suffice it to say this, he habitually wore a towering top hat, was instrumental in constructing half of Victorian Britain, and possessed a name that seemed inherently destined to be accompanied by the thundering presence of a locomotive. Born in 1806, Brunel was the quintessential genius who would effortlessly sketch intricate bridge designs during breakfast, casually redefining the very concept of an impossible project. He engineered tunnels beneath treacherous rivers, suspended bridges majestically over vast valleys, and designed trains that traversed the landscape at speeds that defied conventional common sense. Yet, his grandest aspiration lay with ships. Enormous ships. Truly colossal ships. In the mid-19th century, Brunel meticulously designed the SS Great Eastern. A steamship of such unprecedented scale that it rendered all other vessels mere bath toys by comparison. It stretched over 700 feet in length, was propelled by a dual system of paddle wheels and a screw propeller, and was ingeniously conceived to sail from England to Australia without requiring a single refueling stop. Alas! It was seemingly cursed from its very inception. During its arduous construction, numerous workers lost their lives. Fires frequently erupted. A pivotal launch attempt failed not once, but twice. One unfortunate individual was literally cemented inside a hull panel for days before a perilous rescue. The ship's immense weight necessitated a sideways launch. A maneuver that sounds impressive until one realizes it very nearly flattened an entire warehouse. Brunel, already laboring under immense stress and chain-smoking cigars as if they were life-sustaining oxygen, suffered a debilitating stroke amidst this maelstrom. And not just anywhere, but on the very ship itself, while observing a demonstration of a new engine room feature. Some attribute his demise to the relentless pressure. Others suggest it was the crushing weight of astronomical expectations. Regardless, he passed away merely days before the ship's inaugural voyage in 1859. And here's the truly shocking twist. On that very first journey, the ship exploded. A steam pipe ruptured, claiming 6 lives. The vessel miraculously survived the voyage, but the dream itself had already irrevocably fractured. Brunel's death was not as overtly theatrical as a battlefield demise or a betrayal, but it was profoundly poetic. He was ultimately undone by the very brilliance of his own creations. Pushing the boundaries of human engineering only to discover that the immutable laws of physics and the unpredictable hand of fate do not always align harmoniously. So, while most individuals are interred quietly, Brunel was, in effect, outlived by a colossal floating skyscraper that very nearly crushed his enduring legacy. Still, his bridges stand firm. His tunnels endure, and his iconic top hat remains a symbol of unparalleled vision. Sometimes, the most epic demises occur when one dares to dream a little too grandly, and reality, in turn, does not even flinch. Cleopatra Selene II, the moon that survived the darkness. Cleopatra Selene II entered a world ablaze with unbridled ambition, ancient myth, and relentless political warfare. Her mother was Cleopatra VII, the final pharaoh of Egypt, who grandly styled herself as the living goddess Isis. Her father was Mark Antony, Rome's celebrated general. A man perpetually torn between his unwavering loyalty to the Republic and his profound love for Egypt's enigmatic queen. From the very moment of her birth in 40 BCE, Selene was more than just a child, she was a potent symbol, a living promise that Egypt and Rome could potentially rule in concert, not as bitter rivals, but as steadfast partners. She was born in Alexandria, the city of wonders. Imagine growing up beneath gleaming marble colonnades and towering obelisks, where priests chanted in ancient tongues and philosophers debated profound concepts under the celestial canopy of star-filled maps. The legendary Library of Alexandria was still a breathing repository of knowledge, and the cult of Isis remained a powerful spiritual force. Selene, along with her twin brother, Alexander Helios, received a meticulously crafted royal education, encompassing Greek philosophy, Egyptian religious traditions, and the intricate labyrinth of Roman politics. She learned to navigate a treacherous path that few could even perceive. Yet, despite the pervasive scent of incense and the elaborate ceremonies, she was also born into an inescapable political snare. Cleopatra and Antony had audaciously carved up the eastern Mediterranean like a lavish wedding cake, bestowing upon their young children grandiose titles that, tragically, lacked any real military backing. Little Selene was crowned Queen of Cyrenaica and Libya before she could even articulate her own name. Her name itself, Selene, meaning moon, was a perfect complement to her brother's name, Helios, meaning sun. But the moon would soon be forced to learn how to endure in the deepest darkness. Back in Rome, Octavian, who would later become the revered Augustus, observed these developments with cold, calculating precision. Antony's audacious alliance with Cleopatra was deemed more than merely scandalous. It was treasonous in the extreme. When war inevitably erupted between Octavian and Antony, Selene's destiny was irrevocably sealed by adult choices over which she had absolutely no control. At the tender age of just 10, she witnessed her entire world unravel. The calamitous Battle of Actium in 31 BCE resulted in a crushing defeat for her parents. Her father, Mark Antony, took his own life. Her mother, Cleopatra, famously followed suit, defiantly choosing the swift bite of a cobra over the indignity of a Roman triumphal parade. And then, everything changed. Selene, once cradled in the lap of luxury and gold, was now a prisoner, orphaned, captive of the very man who had utterly destroyed her family. But she did not scream. She did not collapse in despair. History does not record her words from that moment, but it vividly illustrates her subsequent actions. She accomplished what very few royal children managed in the wake of such a cataclysm. She survived. And that was merely the beginning of her extraordinary journey. After the dust of Alexandria had settled, Cleopatra Selene, barely 10 years old, was forcibly transported across the vast Mediterranean as a war trophy. She arrived in Rome not as a princess, but as a living symbol of Octavian's triumphant ascendancy. She and her brothers were paraded through the streets in a chilling spectacle, the children of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, now utterly orphaned, adorned in chains of gold. Compelled to walk in the oppressive shadow of the man who had crushed their dynasty. Imagine that for a moment, the daughter of gods paraded like mere loot. The very streets where Julius Caesar had once been hailed as a conquering hero were now her stage of profound humiliation. Yet, Selene did not weep. No historical records speak of tears or overt rebellion. Instead, the Roman crowd, anticipating a sobbing, terrified child, witnessed a young girl who carried herself with an eerie, almost unnerving poise. Some even suggest that the crowd felt genuine pity for her. And in the ruthless political landscape of Rome, pity could often be far more potent than fear. Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, was not a fool. Killing the children of Antony and Cleopatra would irrevocably tarnish his carefully cultivated image of mercy and civilization. So, he chose a different path. He handed them over to his sister, Octavia, who, coincidentally, had also been Antony's former wife. A cruel twist of fate, undoubtedly. But one that ultimately proved to be a blessing in disguise for Selene. Under Octavia's protective roof, Selene was provided with an education, security, and, surprisingly, a genuine second chance at life. The very woman whose marriage Antony had so flagrantly betrayed now became Selene's unlikely guardian. Octavia was more than just a figurehead in the political arena. She was renowned for her inherent grace and remarkable self-restraint. She ensured that Selene was nurtured with a blend of Roman discipline, Greek intellectual rigor, and just enough Egyptian dignity to serve as a constant reminder of her formidable lineage. Here, nestled in the very heart of Rome, the young queen-in-waiting keenly observed. She meticulously studied the intricate politics of survival, discerning precisely when to speak and when silence could be wielded as a potent weapon. She mastered the nuances of Latin, delved into the intricacies of rhetoric, and immersed herself in the myths of the very people who had ruthlessly dismantled her ancestral line. She keenly noted how Roman women navigated the labyrinthine corridors of power, not through overt displays of crowns, but through carefully orchestrated marriages, subtle influence, and astute cunning. While her brothers gradually receded into historical obscurity, Selene deftly adapted. She chose not to confront Rome with swords, but rather by comprehending its very essence. She absorbed the crucial lesson that survival necessitated becoming indispensable to the very system that had once sought to obliterate her. Publicly, she was merely a ward, a Romanized princess. Yet, concealed behind those calculating eyes was a young woman meticulously plotting her strategic return to the global stage, not through rebellion, but through something far more perilous, marriage. From captive to queen, a strategic alliance. Cleopatra Selene's remarkable transformation from a vulnerable captive to a reigning queen was not achieved through brute force. It was meticulously orchestrated through cunning strategy. As she blossomed into her teenage years, Rome was actively reshaping the world in its own imperial image. And client kings were being positioned like chess pieces across its vast, burgeoning empire. Augustus, ever the consummate political puppet master, perceived in Selene both a potential threat and a valuable opportunity. Consequently, he executed a calculated maneuver. He arranged her marriage. Her chosen husband was King Juba II of Mauritania, himself a scholar king who had been raised in Rome. He was the son of a North African ruler who had pledged allegiance to Julius Caesar, only to lose everything upon Caesar's untimely death. Like Selene, Juba had endured the humiliation of being paraded as a child captive and subsequently raised within the household of Octavia. He was intelligent, impeccably mannered, and Roman to his very core. In essence, he represented a secure investment for Augustus, a king undeniably loyal to Rome, yet sufficiently foreign to effectively govern its distant provinces. Their marriage transcended a mere union, it was a diplomatic masterpiece. Two royal children of conquered empires, both forcibly brought to Rome as trophies, were now strategically paired as rulers of a kingdom they had never explicitly sought. And remarkably, it worked. Selene ascended to the throne as Queen of Mauritania, encompassing modern-day Algeria and Morocco, a land rich in cultural heritage but fraught with political instability. And she reigned not as a mere figurehead, but as a monarch imbued with a profound vision. Together, Selene and Juba dramatically transformed their capital city, Iol, boldly renaming it Caesarea in honor of Augustus. But this was more than a superficial name change. Under Selene's discerning influence, the city flourished into a vibrant amalgamation of Egyptian opulence, Greek artistry, and formidable Roman engineering. Majestic temples rose, grand libraries were meticulously constructed, and coins were minted bearing her distinctive image, adorned with the solar crown of Egyptian royalty. Subtle, perhaps, yet a profoundly powerful homage to her illustrious ancestry. Selene was not merely playing at being queen. She was meticulously etching her indelible mark upon an entire region. While Juba diligently focused on diplomatic affairs and his scholarly pursuits, he considered himself an esteemed historian and geographer. Selene brought unparalleled statecraft to their joint rule. She expertly managed intricate trade networks, generously patronized the arts, and skillfully imbued the kingdom with a unique, hybrid identity that was unmistakably her own creation. Here, far removed from the formidable shadow of Rome and the tragic ruins of Alexandria, Cleopatra Selene did not merely survive, she unequivocally thrived. Her life, once shattered by the brutal realities of politics and bloodshed, had blossomed into something exceedingly rare in the ancient world, a quiet tale of profound reclamation. She was no longer a mere symbol, she was a true sovereign, and she was far from finished. A queen's vision, blending civilizations. Cleopatra Selene was never content to exist as a purely ceremonial figure or a quiet consort to Juba. She had been born into the crucible of empire, educated by profound tragedy, and sharpened by the sting of humiliation. Now, with a throne beneath her and an entire kingdom's destiny at stake, she brought forth something Rome had never quite witnessed, a queen who seamlessly blended three distinct civilizations into a singular, cohesive vision. Mauritania had always been a veritable crossroads of diverse cultures. Berber tribes, Phoenician traders, and the spectral echoes of Carthaginian history lingered along its sun-drenched coasts. But under Selene's discerning guidance, this vibrant mosaic became an intentional masterpiece. She neither imposed a rigid Egyptian dominance, nor did she meekly acquiesce entirely to Roman tastes. Instead, she cunningly and purposefully fused them. She meticulously oversaw the construction of monumental public works, grand harbors, majestic temples, and bustling markets. Roman aqueducts gracefully snaked through cities that resonated with distinct Egyptian symbolism. Statues of Isis stood proudly alongside Roman forums. Greek theaters flourished, showcasing their timeless dramas, while local African-style craftsmanship thrived in parallel. The outcome was not a cacophony of confusion, it was a symphony of harmony. A kingdom that felt simultaneously ancient and strikingly modern, steadfastly loyal to Rome, yet uniquely and unmistakably its own. And throughout this transformative period, Selene remained conspicuously visible. This was a rare distinction for a queen within a client kingdom. Her image graced the kingdom's coinage, not relegated to the background behind her husband, but prominently featured beside him, adorned in royal regalia that deliberately harkened back to the powerful Ptolemaic queens, the solar disk, the vulture crown, potent symbols of divine rulership. These were subtle declarations, perhaps, but powerfully conveyed. Egypt may have fallen, but its illustrious lineage coursed vibrantly through her veins. More than anything, Selene possessed an innate understanding of diplomacy as an art form. She skillfully played Rome's intricate game, yet resolutely refused to let it consume her. She graciously hosted foreign emissaries, meticulously managed crucial grain exports, and reportedly exerted direct influence over the kingdom's taxation policies, particularly in cultivating wealth through bustling trade with the Mediterranean. Under her vigilant stewardship, Mauritania blossomed into an invaluable Roman ally. Not because it meekly bowed to imperial will, but because it operated with remarkable efficiency and profitability. And while Rome's upper echelons gossiped about her exotic bloodline and the controversial legacy of her infamous mother, Selene provided them with absolutely nothing scandalous upon which to pounce. No illicit affairs, no tumultuous uprisings, simply steady progress, unwavering balance, and a quiet, undeniable dominance. Yet, even in her resounding success, the haunting memory of Alexandria lingered. The catastrophic collapse of her dynasty, the ominous cobra in the basket, her father's tragic sword, it never truly left her. But instead of attempting to revive that fallen legacy, she ingeniously encoded it into the very fabric of her rule. Her kingdom became a sanctuary of synthesis. She did not strive to rebuild Egypt. She audaciously reimagined it thousands of miles away on Berber soil. And in doing so, she forged a dynasty that was uniquely her own within Mauritania. Cleopatra Selene had always existed in the liminal space between worlds. She was Egyptian by birthright, Roman by virtue of her upbringing, and now North African by the dictates of her throne. Yet, rather than choosing a single identity, she masterfully embraced and embodied all three. She was simultaneously a daughter of Isis, a quintessential Roman matron, a Hellenistic intellectual, and a wise ruler of desert tribes. In every role she undertook, she was both these things, and ultimately, so much more. But this duality was not merely a clever political stratagem. It was a profound act of survival. Selene intimately understood the grim fate that awaited women who dared to lean too heavily into naked ambition. Her mother had done so and tragically died branded a villain in Roman eyes. She knew that Rome admired a certain docility in its queens, not daring defiance. Consequently, she walked an incredibly precarious tightrope, always regal, always composed. She did not actively court scandal, instead, she diligently courted influence. One of her sharpest instruments was the power of symbolism. On Mauritanian coins, her effigy was far more than mere decoration. She daringly revived the solar crown of the Egyptian pharaohs and brilliantly paired it with distinctly Roman styles, laurel wreaths, togas, and Latin inscriptions. These coins circulated widely across Africa and the Mediterranean, subtly yet persistently reminding traders, nobles, and Roman officials alike. The very blood of Cleopatra still flowed through a ruling queen, and her influence extended far beyond mere aesthetics. Selene actively encouraged religious fusion. The revered cult of Isis was permitted to flourish openly in Mauritania, but so too were Roman deities like Jupiter, alongside the indigenous African spirits sacred to the region. This was not simply a gesture of religious tolerance, it was a meticulously crafted political cohesion. She understood precisely what Augustus had accomplished in Rome, uniting a diverse populace through a shared pantheon. Now, she subtly achieved the same within her own kingdom. Yet, for all her elegance and poise, Selene was never merely a background figure to her husband. Contemporary accounts and compelling archaeological evidence strongly suggest that she played an absolutely crucial role in court decisions. Some historians even posit that she effectively governed in Juba's absence, issuing edicts, meticulously managing vital grain fleets, and skillfully mediating tribal disputes. She was not merely a queen, she was an equal partner in power. And perhaps most remarkably, she achieved all of this without resorting to war. Cleopatra Selene's reign was defined by an unprecedented period of stability, a rarity in the tumultuous ancient world and even more exceptional for a woman of her controversial lineage. She had no need to conquer lands, she conquered imaginations. In Rome, she had once been paraded as a mere prize. Now, she was a true sovereign whose very name commanded respect from senators and merchants alike, not through fear, but through sheer intelligence. A queen who had every conceivable reason to burn with vengeance, yet chose the path of sophisticated strategy instead. A legacy of quiet resilience. The Son of the Moon. As Cleopatra Selene too settled into her role as Queen of Mauritania, her most enduring legacy began to materialize. Not in the cold hardiness of marble or the ephemeral glint of coins, but in the living form of her son, Ptolemy of Mauritania. Born into this meticulously balanced dynasty, Ptolemy represented the final, precious thread of a once glorious bloodline that stretched from the formidable Macedonian conquerors to the divine pharaohs of Egypt. Through him, Selene harbored the profound hope of securing the continuity of everything she had painstakingly rebuilt from ruin. She raised him not merely as a prince, but as a living synthesis of the empires that had shaped her own tumultuous life. Ptolemy's education was of the highest caliber, befitting an individual with direct blood ties to both Julius Caesar and the illustrious Ptolemaic line. He absorbed the intricacies of Latin law, immersed himself in Greek philosophy, and diligently learned Egyptian religious customs. And most importantly, he acquired the nuanced art of diplomacy from the best possible teacher, his own mother. Selene likely saw a reflection of herself in the young boy. Like her, he was born into a complex political chess game. Like her, he would be compelled to navigate and survive in a world where lineage could be both a gleaming crown and a debilitating curse. But unlike her, Ptolemy enjoyed the immeasurable benefit of stability. Of growing up in a kingdom his mother had already painstakingly molded into a sanctuary of harmonious balance. Yet, Selene was far from naive. She had personally witnessed how swiftly dynasties could crumble when heirs grew soft or reckless. Thus, she meticulously prepared him, not with the blunt instruments of swords, but with the refined tools of negotiation, astute politics, and profound cultural understanding. She ensured he would be fluent in the languages of power, both literally and figuratively. But perhaps most fascinating is that Selene never attempted to resurrect Egypt through her son. She knew better. The world had irrevocably changed. Augustus ruled with an iron grip, and any overt attempt to revive old claims would be summarily crushed. Instead, she quietly embedded Egypt into Mauritania's very soul through its temples, its pervasive imagery, its subtle customs. And then carefully passed that subtle legacy to Ptolemy. Her plan, at least for a significant period, worked flawlessly. Ptolemy eventually succeeded his father and reigned as king in his own right. Rome tolerated him, respected him, and even granted him the honor of a consulship. He was treated with the deference due to a prince of the blood, because that is precisely what he was. Through Ptolemy, Selene had achieved what her powerful parents could not. She ensured the survival of their bloodline without a single drop of bloodshed. Her child was not a symbol of defeat, but of profound adaptation. And through him, her silent empire endured, just a little longer. History often favors the loud, the conquerors, the revolutionaries, the mad emperors. But Cleopatra Selene left her indelible legacy in whispers. No dramatic speeches of hers survive. No lengthy scrolls filled with her intricate philosophies. And yet, her fingerprints are unmistakably everywhere, in the enduring coins, the thriving cities, the astute policies, and the quiet, miraculous survival of a dynasty once believed doomed. As she entered the later years of her reign, Selene gradually faded from Roman historical records. Some historians interpret this ensuing silence as a deliberate act of political erasure. Others believe it was by her own design. After all, visibility in Rome often came with a steep price, particularly for a woman with her controversial ancestry. Perhaps she preferred to reign from the shadows, effective, subtly influential, and utterly untouched by scandal. There are no surviving records of scandal in her life, no betrayals, no illicit affairs. No executions ordered in a fit of passion. That in itself is truly remarkable. Selene navigated a world profoundly shaped by male egos, constantly shifting alliances, and ingrained cultural prejudice. Without once affording her adversaries a strategic foothold. She comprehended power not as something to overtly display, but rather as a force to be wielded with subtle precision. And perhaps that very subtlety was her ultimate form of retribution. One of her most profound actions may well have been the complete absence of vengeance. Unlike her formidable mother, she never sought to aggressively reclaim Egypt. She did not openly challenge Augustus or actively agitate against Rome. Instead, she steadfastly ensured that her people, those who had followed her from the shattered remnants of Alexandria or still revered the ancient gods, were granted refuge and a renewed sense of purpose within her unique hybrid kingdom. Archaeological findings strongly suggest that Mauritania, under her astute reign, experienced a vibrant fusion of religious practices. Egyptian funerary art has been unearthed alongside Roman mosaics, and North African shrines dedicated to Isis were nestled beside altars to Jupiter. It was a spiritual mosaic, meticulously held together by her quiet, guiding hand. Even the capital city of Caesarea bore her unmistakable influence. While named in honor of Augustus, its very soul profoundly reflected her vision. Public works flourished, and the city's architecture embraced Hellenistic elegance. While local crafts were elevated to a status of state-sponsored prestige. She wasn't attempting to rebuild Alexandria, she was, in essence, outgrowing it. And yet, there always lingered the pervasive memory of her mother, simultaneously glorified and vilified, of her father, disgraced and utterly fallen, of a city lost, a dynasty irrevocably ended, and a bloodline nearly erased. Selene never explicitly spoke of these profound losses. History does not grant us her direct voice. But she had no need for words. Her silence was a language unto itself. Every policy she crafted, every temple she generously funded, every symbol she chose to wear was a poignant sentence in an unwritten memoir. The world may have forgotten her words, but it profoundly remembered her results. And then, as mysteriously as she had navigated her life, she was gone. Cleopatra Selene, Queen. Daughter of two legends, ruler of a kingdom meticulously crafted in cultural gold, simply vanishes from the historical record. There is no triumphant obituary, no grand, preserved tomb. And no Roman historian deemed her final days worthy of detailed documentation. For someone born amidst the dazzling fireworks of history, her end came like a gently fading candle. We can only approximate her death around 5 BCE, based on the abrupt disappearance of her name from official documents and coinage. One day she was co-ruling Mauritania, the next. Only Juba's image appeared on the currency. No fanfare, no funeral inscription, just profound silence. But that silence is remarkably telling. In ancient royal circles, a quiet exit often signified one of two possibilities: either she died naturally and was privately mourned, or there were powerful reasons to meticulously erase her presence. And considering the treacherous political tightrope she had walked for decades, both scenarios are entirely plausible. Still, there is no discernible hint of scandal. Juba continued to rule after her death. However, Mauritania never again shone with quite the same brilliance. He did marry again, to Glafra, a Cappadocian princess. But that marriage was brief and left a far less significant legacy. Juba continued to write books and govern dutifully, but something about the realm seemed dimmer, less vibrant. Selene, it appeared, had been more than just a queen, she had been the very soul of the court. Her son, Ptolemy, eventually took on the mantle after his parents. But even he would meet a tragic end. Executed in Rome by the erratic Emperor Caligula decades later, for reasons still debated. With his death, Cleopatra Selene's bloodline was truly extinguished. And yet, her indelible fingerprints remained. Coins bearing her crowned image continued to circulate throughout the empire. The Egyptian cults she had quietly supported endured in North Africa for centuries. The cities she had so meticulously shaped, like Caesarea, flourished as vibrant hubs of trade and learning under Roman rule. Her legacy persisted not in thunderclaps, but in the long, slow, inexorable turning of civilization's wheel. She had no epic tomb, but she built a kingdom. She left no famous speeches, but her policies fundamentally changed countless lives. She raised no armies, but she conquered the chaos bequeathed by her parents and skillfully transformed it into enduring order. Cleopatra Selene vanished from the page. But only because she had already indelibly etched herself into the very fabric of empire. And perhaps that was her final act of brilliance, to vanish not as a victim of history, but as its quiet, masterful architect. The enduring legacy of the last Ptolemy. Cleopatra Selene too may have departed in silence, but her story, in essence, did not conclude there. Her profound legacy lived on through her son, Ptolemy of Mauritania, a prince who embodied centuries of ambition, myth, and hard-won survival. He was the very last known descendant of the illustrious Ptolemaic dynasty, the final living echo of Alexander the Great's generals and the venerable Egyptian pharaohs. Raised within the polished world his mother had so carefully constructed, Ptolemy inherited not merely a kingdom, but a delicate, intricate political legacy. He was young, exceedingly wealthy, and thoroughly Romanized, fluent in Greek, Latin, and the subtle arts of diplomacy. His reign in Mauritania, though perhaps not as profoundly transformative as his mother's, was characterized by continued prosperity and unwavering loyalty to Rome. However, he walked an inherently dangerous tightrope. A client king possessed of royal blood too grand for Rome to simply ignore. Initially, he played his role with consummate skill. Augustus had magnanimously granted him the esteemed rank of Roman senator, and subsequent emperors welcomed him at court. He was widely praised for his immense wealth, his remarkable generosity, and his undeniably elegant lifestyle. The man wore purple, as was his inherent right, and he dined comfortably with emperors. Yet, with every nod of imperial favor came a quiet whisper of envy. Ptolemy possessed something that many Roman nobles feared, an ancient, undeniable legitimacy. And Rome, particularly under its more unstable rulers, never truly trusted such a powerful legacy. His ultimate downfall arrived under the notoriously erratic Emperor Caligula. Ptolemy visited Rome around 40 CE, reportedly adorned in regal splendor, perhaps, in hindsight, too much splendor for Caligula's fragile ego. According to ancient sources, Caligula chillingly declared, "There is only room for one king in Rome." Soon thereafter, Ptolemy was summarily executed. No formal trial, no declared war, just sudden, brutal erasure. With his death, the dynasty of Cleopatra, of Alexander, of Isis herself, was finally and irrevocably extinguished. The bloodline that had once ruled the most learned city on earth ended not with a grand battle or a tumultuous rebellion, but with a paranoid emperor's capricious whim. But Ptolemy's death, much like his mother's quiet departure, did not erase their pervasive influence. Mauritania was subsequently annexed and reorganized into a Roman province. Yet, it continued to bear the precise blueprint Selene had meticulously drawn, its cities, its temples, its distinctive hybrid traditions. Even in death, she continued to shape the land. And though Rome relentlessly attempted to bury the dynasty, it never quite succeeded. The Ptolemies transcended into myth. Cleopatra Selene, once paraded as a mere spoil of war, had remarkably outlived her enemies through the power of legacy, the enduring force of culture, and the brief, yet glittering, flame of her son. The last Ptolemy fell. But the world he inherited still bore her name, her symbols, and her silent, unyielding strength. The genesis of knowledge, Ashurbanipal's clay library. Before the advent of printed books. Even before the ink-drenched scrolls of Alexandria, there was clay, cold, heavy, and possessing an oddly eternal quality. And atop that clay, meticulously scratched in cuneiform, resided the earliest known library in human history, painstakingly constructed by a king who yearned to be remembered not for conquest, but for the profound pursuit of knowledge. Welcome to Nineveh. The year is approximately 650 BCE. The reigning monarch is Ashurbanipal, the formidable ruler of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and self-proclaimed king of the world. Yet, unlike most rulers of his epoch, Ashurbanipal was not content with merely grand temples and an endless array of war trophies. He aspired to something far more profound, a secure vault for the entirety of human wisdom. In the very heart of his sprawling palace complex, he commanded the creation of a massive repository of knowledge. The library of Ashurbanipal was no mere storage closet, it was a deliberate, monumental project aimed at collecting, meticulously organizing, and vigilantly protecting the vast intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia. And by collect, we imply a comprehensive process of confiscation, diligent copying, and systematic cataloging. Royal agents were dispatched across the immense empire, demanding texts from priests, scholars, and scribes alike. By the time the library neared its completion, it housed an astonishing collection of over 30,000 clay tablets, covering an incredibly diverse range of subjects: medicine, astrology, intricate religious rituals, solemn royal decrees, complex legal codes, comprehensive dictionaries, and even tender love poems and precise exorcism instructions. And among this treasure trove resided the oldest known version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed with painstaking care in meticulous lines upon baked clay. Each tablet was carefully labeled and categorized, then precisely shelved in separate rooms according to its genre and function. Ashurbanipal's library even incorporated a rudimentary referencing system, with identifying labels deftly etched into the tablets, indicating where each text belonged. One might accurately describe it as a proto-catalog, conceived long before librarians ever invented card systems. And Ashurbanipal himself? He read them, or at least he proudly claimed to. Unlike the vast majority of kings, he boasted of being literate in both Sumerian and Akkadian, languages that were already ancient even in his own time. His royal inscriptions grandly declare, "I have read the cunningly written tablets of Sumer and the obscure Akkadian language which is hard to master." But this invaluable treasure trove would not endure indefinitely. When Nineveh tragically fell to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes in 612 BCE, the palace was razed to the ground by fire. Ironically, that very fire served to preserve many of the priceless tablets by baking them hard, thus meticulously locking their precious texts in time. Thousands of years later, archaeologists painstakingly unearthed the scorched remains of the library. And in that profound silence, they discovered a king's enduring dream, a resilient clay time capsule of human memory, stubbornly refusing to fade into oblivion. Houses of life, papyrus sanctuaries of Egyptian wisdom. While Assyria meticulously carved knowledge into resilient clay, the ancient Egyptians gracefully etched their profound wisdom into something far more elegant and flexible: papyrus. And with this ingenious material, they meticulously constructed some of the world's earliest and most revered literary sanctuaries, known as the House of Life, a sophisticated fusion of temple, scriptorium, and archive. These were not public libraries in the modern sense, but rather sacred, guarded spaces where priests, scribes, and esteemed scholars vigilantly safeguarded the deepest secrets of their civilization. Strategically situated within major temple complexes, such as Abydos, Thebes, and Edfu, the House of Life was considered a living institution, intimately interwoven with the divine. Particularly with Thoth, the revered deity of wisdom, writing, and magic. Within these hallowed walls, scribes meticulously copied texts by hand, including mythological hymns. Intricate funerary spells, precise astronomical records, comprehensive medical manuals, crucial legal documents, and vital administrative roles. Each meticulously crafted scroll was believed to embody not merely words, but sacred, divine power. The work was painstaking, incredibly repetitive, and imbued with profound spiritual significance. Scribes underwent rigorous training from early childhood in the intricate art of hieroglyphs and the more fluid hieratic script. A mistake was not simply a scribal error. It was considered a grave spiritual failing. And papyrus itself, being both fragile and exceedingly precious, could only be stored under dry, meticulously managed conditions. Scrolls were carefully kept in sturdy wooden boxes or within sealed ceramic jars, each meticulously labeled with string and tags. Every House of Life maintained its own unique classification system. Though regrettably, none have survived in full detail. Perhaps the most renowned example was located at Parank in Thebes, where royal medical texts were painstakingly copied and preserved for countless generations. It is highly probable that this was the very location where the Ebers Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical treatise replete with remedies, incantations, and surgical guidance, was originally produced and subsequently transmitted. However, access to these invaluable libraries was rigorously restricted. They weren't places of public enlightenment, but exclusive workshops for priests and royal advisors. In Egypt, knowledge was power. And power was fiercely guarded. What you knew could dictate your social standing, your religious function, or even your destiny in the afterlife. Especially when that knowledge included potent spells from the Book of the Dead. And yet, these institutions served as crucial bridges, connecting one generation of scribes to the next. Diligently preserving Egypt's core cultural identity through periods of conquest, devastating drought, and tumultuous dynastic shifts. When invaders arrived, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the Houses of Life gradually faded. Their precious scrolls either vanished, were deliberately burned, or simply succumbed to decay. But fragments still survive in tombs, buried alongside mummies or scattered through the channels of ancient trade. Whispered in fading ink on brittle papyrus, the profound wisdom of ancient Egypt never entirely disappeared. It merely slipped between the cracks of history, patiently awaiting rediscovery. Babylon's information empire, bricks, stars, and divine order. Long before the advent of modern catalogs, Babylon cultivated its own sophisticated information empire, meticulously constructed upon foundations of baked bricks, celestial observations, and a deeply ingrained sense of divine order. While Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh might be the most celebrated, Babylon's centers of learning stretched across numerous temples, towering ziggurats, and opulent royal courts. Here, libraries were far more than mere collections of texts. They were considered cosmological blueprints, safeguarding the esoteric secrets of gods, calendars, and kings. At the very heart of Babylon's scholarly life were the grand temples of Esagila and Ezida, serving as the revered homes of priest-scholars known as Umanu. These individuals were not merely scribes. They were formidable mathematicians, keen astronomers, skilled healers, and insightful astrologers. Their libraries, though compact, were remarkably durable and incredibly specific. Clay tablets, meticulously inscribed with lists, ominous omens, intricate rituals, and complex calculations, were carefully stacked in clay jars or neatly pigeonholed into specialized niches within walls. Much like ancient filing cabinets. One of the most extraordinary Babylonian contributions was the Enuma Anu Enlil, a colossal compilation of celestial omens. This monumental work meticulously recorded thousands of years of star and planet observations, intricately linked with predictions concerning war, plague, or prosperity. These texts were not simply academic, they were rigorously consulted before critical royal decisions, major battles, and even solemn coronations. In a world profoundly governed by signs and portents, these tablets served as crucial oracles. And Babylon's intellectual pursuits didn't halt at astronomy. Their libraries contained advanced mathematical texts that clearly demonstrate complex geometry and early forms of algebra. The Plimpton 322 tablet, for instance, exhibits sophisticated trigonometric calculations that astonishingly predate Greek mathematics by over a millennium. To contemporary scholars, it reads strikingly like an early draft of a calculus textbook. Babylonian scribes employed a system of colophons, tiny notes appended to the end of tablets that disclose the scribe's name, the source material, and occasionally, stern warnings against stealing or misusing the knowledge. These were not just records, they were, in essence, ancient intellectual property claims. But as Babylon transitioned from one conqueror to another, Hittites, Persians, Greeks, its once flourishing libraries gradually entered a period of decline. Many tablets were systematically looted or tragically broken, their fragments scattered within layers of rubble beneath centuries of accumulating dust. The arid climate providentially preserved some, but the vast majority remained buried and forgotten until the 19th century, when archaeological excavations unearthed thousands of them. Even in their fractured state, these tablets spoke volumes. In pieces no larger than a human palm, they meticulously preserved recipes, laws, spells, and the precise motions of stars. They irrefutably demonstrated that long before the philosophical musings of Aristotle or the geometric theorems of Euclid, the peoples of Mesopotamia had constructed a profound knowledge system. One that was both eminently practical and deeply poetic. Babylon's shelves may have crumbled to dust, but its clay voices still powerfully whisper from the silent ruins. Alexandria, the beacon of ancient scholarship. If knowledge possessed a capital in the ancient world, it was undoubtedly Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great and subsequently ruled by his successors, the Ptolemies, this vibrant Greco-Egyptian city rapidly became the preeminent beacon of ancient scholarship. And its very heart was the magnificent Great Library of Alexandria. Established in the 3rd century BCE within the sprawling temple complex known as the Mouseion, a sacred sanctuary dedicated to the Muses, the Library of Alexandria was far more than a mere building. It was an audacious dream to systematically collect every book, every scroll, and every scrap of knowledge the world had to offer. It was not a quiet room for local scholars but an intellectual empire of unparalleled ambition. Under the patronage of kings like Ptolemy I Soter and Ptolemy II Philadelphus, agents were dispatched across the entire Mediterranean, charged with the singular mission of acquiring or diligently copying scrolls from every port. Ships that docked in Alexandria were rigorously searched, and any scrolls discovered on board were immediately seized, copied, and then meticulously stored within the library. Even foreign works, ancient Hebrew scriptures, intricate Indian treatises, sophisticated Babylonian astronomical observations, were assiduously translated into Greek. Estimates suggest the library may have housed an astonishing collection of between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. These encompassed every conceivable field: philosophy, medicine, engineering, poetry, botany, history, everything. Homer's timeless works were meticulously edited and standardized here. Archimedes' groundbreaking ideas passed through its hallowed walls. Even Eratosthenes, the renowned librarian, utilized its vast resources to calculate the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. The library wasn't solely focused on collection. It was equally dedicated to correction. Scholars within its hallowed halls meticulously compared different versions of texts, precisely identified errors, and consequently created the earliest critical editions of ancient works. They preserved the best and rigorously questioned the rest. However, Alexandria's very brilliance also rendered it inherently fragile. Fires, wars, and political turmoil gradually chipped away at its scroll-stuffed shelves. The first significant blow may have occurred in 48 BCE when Julius Caesar's forces, trapped within Alexandria's harbor, set fire to enemy ships and inadvertently ignited portions of the library complex. Later, as the Roman Empire solidified its dominion, Alexandria frequently became a battleground of competing ideologies, pagan, Christian, Gnostic, and its library suffered greatly as a result. By the time of the Muslim conquest in 642 CE, it remains unclear precisely what survived. Some sources claim that Caliph Umar ordered its deliberate destruction, famously asserting, "If the books agree with the Quran, they are redundant. If not, they are heretical." However, historians vigorously debate whether the library had already largely vanished centuries before this event. What is undeniably certain is this: the Great Library is gone. Not a single original scroll survives today. And yet, its legend persists, irrefutable proof that the very idea of a universal library was too powerful to be completely consumed by flames. Alexandria became a profound symbol of what humanity once possessed and, tragically, what it irrevocably lost. Pergamon, the Parchment Revolution. While Alexandria basked in its unparalleled fame, another city was quietly constructing a formidable rival library. One that would not only challenge Alexandria's intellectual dominance but also fundamentally revolutionize the very material of writing. That city was Pergamon, situated in what is now modern-day Turkey. Under the enlightened rule of the Adalid dynasty in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, Pergamon blossomed into a cultural powerhouse. And at its very core stood the magnificent Library of Pergamon. Founded by King Eumenes II, the library was reputed to house over 200,000 scrolls, making it second only to Alexandria in sheer volume. But its significance extended far beyond mere numbers. Pergamon placed a profound emphasis on quality, meticulously curating its texts, maintaining impeccable organization, and fostering a scholarly environment that actively nurtured philosophical thought, medical advancement, and rigorous historical documentation. And it possessed one truly critical advantage: parchment. Legend has it that when the Ptolemies of Egypt learned of Pergamon's burgeoning intellectual prowess, they imposed a strict ban on the export of papyrus. While not an entirely novel material, Pergamon scribes elevated its preparation to an unparalleled level, transforming it into a durable, reusable, and significantly smoother writing surface, far more resistant to moisture than fragile papyrus. This technological leap fundamentally altered everything. Scrolls became sturdier, far more long-lasting, and eventually, more portable. It marked a pivotal moment in the evolution from the cumbersome scroll to the more practical codex, the direct precursor of the modern bound book. The Library of Pergamon was not simply a vast depository, it was a vibrant scholarly hive. It attracted prominent philosophers from both the Stoic and Peripatetic schools and actively supported groundbreaking advances in medicine, including early surgical studies. Galen, one of antiquity's most celebrated physicians, was born in Pergamon and very likely studied texts from the library itself. The intense competition between Pergamon and Alexandria fostered a kind of intellectual arms race. Eminent scholars were actively lured with generous salaries, comfortable housing, and significant prestige. Rulers became zealous patrons of erudition, and cities competed not in destructive warfare, but in the peaceful pursuit of wisdom. For a brief, effulgent period, it was a golden age of systematic collection and meticulous conservation. Eventually, Pergamon's impressive collection of scrolls would meet a peculiar fate. When Mark Antony famously married Cleopatra, he reportedly gifted Pergamon's entire library, scrolls and all, to Alexandria as a grand gesture of love. Whether this captivating tale is historical truth or enduring myth, it profoundly symbolizes how intimately tied these invaluable repositories of wisdom were to the capricious forces of power, empire, and romance. Though Pergamon's library no longer stands, its legacy lives on in every bound book we encounter today. Its revolutionary parchment outlasted mighty empires. And while its original scrolls may have been lost, its innovations quite literally rewrote history. Imperial China. Libraries of bureaucracy and history. While the Mediterranean world was actively trading scrolls and perfecting parchment across the globe, ancient China was meticulously constructing its own formidable literary empire, one rooted not in fleeting myth or the flicker of firelight, but in the enduring principles of bureaucracy. Meticulous historical record-keeping, and an unwavering reverence for the written word. The libraries of the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, were far more than mere storehouses of knowledge. They were vital instruments of government, expressions of national identity, and bastions of social order. The Han emperors grasped a crucial truth. Whoever controlled the records controlled the narrative. Consequently, they initiated a massive imperial undertaking to systematically collect, painstakingly copy, and rigorously standardize texts. This wasn't just about preserving classical works, it was about actively shaping the very culture of the empire. Confucianism had, by this time, become the foundational state ideology. And its fundamental texts, such as the Analects, the Book of Rites, and the Book of Documents, were meticulously curated and enshrined within imperial libraries. The most prominent of these was the Imperial Library at Chang'an, the Han capital. Unlike the Library of Alexandria, it was not accessible to wandering scholars. Instead, it functioned as a highly controlled state archive, overseen by a cadre of court historians, esteemed scholars, and diligent scribes. Within its hallowed walls were not only classical literary works but also critical census records, precise astronomical observations, detailed maps, comprehensive legal codes, and elaborate genealogies. Every stroke of ink upon bamboo strips or delicate silk scrolls was backed by the immense weight of the empire. One of the most influential librarians in history emerged from this very system, Lu Xiang, a Han scholar specifically tasked with organizing the imperial collection. He didn't merely catalog books. He meticulously edited and annotated them, often making critical decisions about which versions of texts would endure. His son, Lu Xian, continued this monumental work and developed one of the earliest known classification systems, grouping texts into 6 major categories: classics, philosophy, poetry, warfare, medicine, and divination. These extraordinary efforts were not without significant risk. During the preceding Qin dynasty, the infamous burning of books and burying of scholars had tragically wiped out thousands of ancient works. The Han recognized the immense stakes. Their libraries were an act of profound cultural recovery, a systematic resurrection from the ashes of past destruction. However, the format itself was inherently fragile. Early texts were painstakingly written on bamboo slips, laboriously tied together with string, rendering them vulnerable to fire, mold, and the ravages of time. Others were inked onto silk, a delicate and costly material. Still, thanks to the concerted efforts of the Han, a significant portion of China's classical heritage was salvaged. The imperial libraries, though less mythologized than Alexandria's, may have, in practical terms, preserved far more. In China, the pen didn't just rival the sword, it meticulously archived it. Buddhist libraries, sanctuaries of sacred wisdom. As Buddhism gracefully spread across Asia, so too did something else: libraries. Temples transformed into more than just places of solemn prayer. They evolved into vast archives of profound thought, serene havens of scholarship, and formidable fortresses safeguarding fragile wisdom. From the fertile plains of India to the distant shores of China, from the mystical highlands of Tibet to the serene islands of Japan, the Buddhist world meticulously constructed repositories that treated books not merely as utilitarian tools, but as sacred, living objects. This revered tradition originated in India, Where early Buddhist texts, known as sutras, were primarily memorized orally by monks. However, as the Buddhist canon expanded exponentially, so too did the imperative need to commit these teachings to writing. Palm leaf manuscripts were meticulously inscribed in ink, carefully tied with string, and then reverently wrapped in silk or protective cloth. The monasteries that housed these invaluable texts were far more than spiritual centers. They were, in essence, the ancient world's most secure safe houses for learning and enlightenment. Forests still densely covered the land. The ocean provided an abundant supply of fish. The soil remained fertile and rich. The construction of the first moai was still generations away. But the cultural and spiritual groundwork had been meticulously laid for what would eventually become one of the most extraordinary sculptural legacies on Earth. The captivating story had only just begun. Reino Raraku, the birthplace of giants. At the very heart of Rapa Nui's sacred geography lies Reino Raraku, a distinctive volcanic crater characterized by steep slopes and remarkably soft, carvable stone. It was here that the vast majority of the island's majestic moai statues were born. Not from fleeting legends or myths, but from arduous, painstaking craftsmanship. The rock employed for these colossal figures was a type of volcanic tuff, a compressed ash stone that was relatively pliable and ideally suited for carving, at least in its initial stages. Over time, prolonged exposure to the relentless elements would gradually harden the statues into their familiar, weathered state. Reino Raraku was far more than a mere quarry, it was a spiritual workshop. A site of profound pilgrimage, intense physical exertion, and sacred labor. From its dramatic cliff faces and sloping hillsides, the Rapa Nui sculptors meticulously carved hundreds of moai. Some still half-finished, others fully completed but inexplicably never transported. Today, nearly 400 statues remain at the site, seemingly frozen mid-process. As if the artisans simply vanished in an instant. Carving a moai was by no means a trivial undertaking. Each statue was specifically commissioned by a clan to honor a particular ancestor. Typically a powerful chief. The designs meticulously adhered to a symbolic formula: an elongated face, a heavy brow, long ears, and a prominent nose. The body was often only subtly indicated, with arms pressed close against the torso and fingers carved in thin, stylized relief. The moai varied significantly in size, ranging from modest 6-foot figures to the colossal, El Gigante. An unfinished statue exceeding 70 feet in height and estimated to weigh a staggering 150 tons. Carvers utilized handheld tools fashioned from hard basalt, a much tougher volcanic rock meticulously chipped into chisels and axes. The entire process spanned months, even years, demanding dedicated teams of artisans who meticulously passed down their invaluable knowledge through successive generations. As they worked, the moai remained physically connected to the rock face. Only when nearly complete would they be carefully detached, slid downhill, and meticulously prepared for transport. What renders Reino Raraku so haunting today is the sheer multitude of statues still partially embedded in the earth. Many appear half-buried, but in reality, they are full-bodied figures whose lower halves have been gradually swallowed by centuries of accumulated soil due to erosion. This creates the eerie illusion that the moai are slowly sinking, when in truth, they have patiently stood neck-deep in the sands of time. This volcanic crater was truly the womb of the island's giants, a place where unyielding stone and profound spirit converged, where human hands expertly shaped volcanic ash into eternal ancestors. The silent guardians. The inland gaze of the moai. One of the most intriguing characteristics of the moai is not merely how they were carved, but their intentional gaze. Nearly every moai statue on Rapa Nui faces inland, purposefully turned away from the vast expanse of the ocean. This was by no means accidental. The moai were not intended to observe the waves, they were intently watching the people. Each statue stood upon a stone platform known as an ahu, A sacred ceremonial site that served both as a foundational base and often as the burial place for the significant individual the moai represented. These ahus dotted the island's coastlines like spiritual outposts, firmly anchoring each clan's territory and directing their gaze towards the very heart of their communities. The moai, in essence, served as formidable guardians, embodying powerful ancestors who vigilantly watched over the villages and offered profound spiritual protection. To the Rapa Nui people, the moai transcended mere sculptures. They were considered living presences, vessels imbued with mana, a sacred spiritual energy believed to reside in gods, chiefs, and revered deceased individuals. Once ceremonially erected, a moai was believed to channel mana into the land, thereby ensuring fertility, abundant harvests, and the overall well-being of the clan. They were not merely memorials. They were active participants in daily life, serving as crucial mediators between the spiritual and physical realms. The moai's exaggerated features were deliberately chosen to reflect both idealized ancestry and divine authority. Their deep-set eyes, prominent cheekbones, and elongated noses were visual metaphors for wisdom, strength, and sacred lineage. The extended ears may have symbolized the elite class, while the statue's stoic expressions evoked a sense of calm, eternal vigilance. Some moai were also topped with large, red stone topknots called pukeo, quarried from a distinct volcanic site, Puna Pau. These cylinder-shaped additions may have represented elaborate hairstyles or ceremonial headdresses, further denoting status and reverence. Originally, the statues also featured inlaid coral eyes with pupils made of obsidian or red scoria, imbuing them with a far more lifelike and intense presence than the empty eye sockets observed today. When the eyes were ceremonially added, the moai were said to see for the first time, transforming from inert stone into sacred, living entities. The inland gaze of the moai unequivocally reveals the profound core of Rapa Nui spirituality. These statues were never intended for outsiders, they were meticulously crafted for the people. Silently observing their descendants generation after generation, immovable, unblinking, and eternally vigilant. The walking giants, unraveling the moai's movement. How does one move a 30-foot, 80-ton stone statue without the aid of wheels, cranes, or metal tools across miles of rugged terrain? For centuries, this remained the great enigma of Rapa Nui. The island's moai are scattered across vast distances, with many positioned on stone ahu platforms far from their quarry at Reino Raraku. Early theories posited dragging them on wooden sledges or rolling them on logs, ideas that invariably raised even more questions, particularly given the island's severe deforestation. Others, more fanciful, suggested extraterrestrial intervention or levitation through mystical spiritual power. But the true answer may very well reside in the island's own venerable oral history. According to Rapa Nui legend, the moai literally walked to their destinations. At first glance, this sounds like pure myth. However, in recent years, researchers have taken this idea literally and, remarkably, found success. In 2012, archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lippo conducted a remarkable experiment. Utilizing ropes and teams of people strategically positioned on each side of a replica moai, they successfully managed to rock the statue forward in a controlled, upright manner. Akin to the technique used for shimmying a heavy refrigerator. The crucial elements were balance, rhythmic coordination, and precise timing. In this manner, the moai could indeed have been transported standing upright, precisely as the legends described. No logs, no arduous dragging, no science fiction. Just ingenious human innovation and deeply ingrained tradition. The base of many moai also lends credence to this theory. They possess distinctively curved bottoms. Flat in the rear and rounded in the front, strongly suggesting they were specifically designed to tilt and pivot forward, rather than being laid down for transport. This method of movement would have necessitated large teams, ropes meticulously crafted from plant fibers, and, above all, unwavering faith in Rapa Nui spirituality. The power to move the moai was explicitly attributed to mana, the sacred energy of the ancestors. Chiefs and priests were believed to command this spiritual force, which could, during rituals, animate the statues. So, while engineers perceive physics at work, the Rapa Nui saw the divine. In truth, both perspectives were correct. Transporting moai was not merely an engineering challenge. It was a profound ceremonial act, a public demonstration of unity, unwavering devotion, and deep ancestral connection. The moai did not move by magic. They moved because people profoundly believed they had to. And in that collective belief, Rapa Nui's greatest engineering marvel was not merely stone. It was human cooperation driven by a profound spiritual purpose. The race of giants, the moai's competitive evolution. As centuries passed, the construction of moai did not diminish. It dramatically accelerated. The initial harmony among Rapa Nui's clans gradually gave way to escalating rivalry. As each group sought to honor its ancestors with increasingly larger and more imposing statues. What began as a sincere spiritual tribute progressively evolved into a highly competitive tradition rooted in monumental pride. Clans fiercely vied for dominance, not through direct warfare, but through unparalleled stone craftsmanship. Bigger moai meant more mana, greater prestige, and a stronger claim to ancestral power. Each clan relentlessly sought to outdo the others. Erecting taller statues, incorporating new, elaborate features, and developing more intricate ceremonial platforms. The intense competition was not solely about sheer size. It was fundamentally about spiritual superiority. This relentless competition spurred significant innovations. The introduction of pukeo. Large red stone topknots quarried from the distinct volcanic stone at Puna Pau, added both impressive height and substantial symbolic weight. These topknots, some weighing up to 12 tons, may have represented elaborate hairstyles worn by high-ranking chiefs or sacred headdresses, visual reminders of divine favor. Moai design also underwent a noticeable evolution. Early statues were comparatively short and wide, but over time, they became slimmer, more angular, and dramatically taller. Some of the later moai exceeded 30 feet in height. The island's precious forests were systematically cut down. Timber was likely used for a variety of purposes: food cultivation, fuel, building canoes, and, according to older theories, for statue transportation. As the tree cover vanished, soil erosion worsened dramatically, agricultural yields precipitously declined, and freshwater sources became increasingly difficult to manage. The very resources that sustained the moai culture were slowly but surely being exhausted. And yet, the people did not stop. Instead, they carved more statues, even larger ones. They delved deeper into their spiritual traditions, fervently hoping the ancestors would somehow restore balance. But the delicate balance was already irrevocably tipping. As the island's ecology deteriorated, tensions between clans began to simmer. Competition morphed into deep-seated resentment. The collaborative spirit that had once miraculously moved giants was fracturing under the immense strain of survival. The golden age of moai building had devolved into a crushing burden. Yet, to cease construction was unthinkable. The moai were more than mere symbols, they were the very heartbeat of Rapa Nui's identity. So the islanders continued, carving their devotion from stone, even as the earth beneath them withered. A spiritual arms race was well underway, and no one could afford to lose. The island's unraveling, the silence of the stones. By the 17th century, the unthinkable had occurred. Rapa Nui was slowly but definitively unraveling. The very system that had once unified the island, ancestor worship expressed through colossal moai construction, had pushed its finite resources to the absolute breaking point. The forests were gone. Without trees, there were no canoes for crucial deep-sea fishing, no wood for building shelters or cooking, and no protection from the island's harsh sun and relentless winds. The rich volcanic soil, once protected by roots and shade, had severely eroded. Crops withered from lack of water and nutrients. Fresh water became increasingly scarce. And yet, even as mere survival became an arduous struggle, the statues kept coming, larger, more elaborate, and more demanding of precious labor. The spiritual engine of the island had no brakes. But soon, the people undertook a drastic, desperate action. They ceased erecting the moai. Some statues were abandoned mid-transport, left lying along ancient roads like forgotten giants. Others remained half-finished at the quarry, their chisels frozen in time. The spiritual arms race had reached its absolute limit. The revered ancestors could no longer provide what the exhausted earth could not sustain. Then came the topplings. Archaeological evidence clearly indicates that beginning in the late 1600s, moai across the island were deliberately pushed over, their massive necks snapped, and their faces shattered. This was not the work of natural forces, it was the direct consequence of human conflict. Clans began warring intensely over diminishing land, scarce water, and dwindling prestige. The very statues that had once embodied unity became targets of vengeful rage. Oral traditions vividly describe this period as the Huri Moai, the time of statue toppling. With faith in the moai system collapsing, power dramatically shifted toward a new spiritual and political order, the Birdman cult, which emphasized agility, fierce competition, and ritualistic warfare over the ancestral mana. This profound cultural upheaval unmistakably marked the end of an era. By the time the first European visitors arrived in 1722, they encountered an island society vastly different from the one that had meticulously carved the moai. None of the statues remained standing on their platforms. The once vibrant spiritual system was utterly broken, and the people struggled desperately to survive in a deforested, divided land. The downfall of Rapa Nui was not caused by a single catastrophic event, it was a slow-motion collapse triggered by environmental exhaustion, intense social competition, and a spiritual system that proved unable to adapt quickly enough. What remained were toppled stone gods, staring up at the sky, as if silently questioning how it all went so terribly wrong. The devastating arrival, Rapa Nui in the Age of Contact. When Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday in 1722, he found a society that had already endured profound collapse. The moai stood toppled. The forests were gone. The Rapa Nui people were few in number, thin, weary, and visibly weathered by generations of hardship. Roggeveen's men noted the statues and the barren landscape, but fundamentally failed to comprehend the complex civilization that had created them. And then, the outsiders kept coming. Over the next 2 centuries, European contact brought unprecedented devastation to Rapa Nui. Whalers, missionaries, traders, and slavers arrived, each leaving their own indelible mark. And most of them erased far more than they ever recorded. In 1862, Peruvian slave raiders kidnapped nearly 1,500 Rapa Nui people, including the high chiefs and scribes, effectively decapitating the island's intellectual and spiritual leadership. Only a handful ever returned. Along with them came smallpox, which spread like wildfire among the vulnerable survivors. Worse still was the relentless arrival of Christian missionaries who sought to civilize the islanders. They brutally banned traditional rituals, destroyed sacred carvings, and forced conversions, often replacing the moai-centered spiritual life with imported European practices. The rich oral traditions that had preserved the island's history for centuries were systematically suppressed. And a unique written language, Rongorongo, possibly the only indigenous script in Oceania, was all but lost. By the late 19th century, the island's population had plummeted to just over 100 people. Colonial powers carved up Rapa Nui's land and callously leased it as sheep pasture, fencing off ancestral sites and confining the surviving Rapa Nui people to a tiny corner of their ancestral island. Even their ability to access the sacred moai was severely restricted. The statues, once living symbols of family and power, became silent monuments, neglected, looted, or treated as mere curiosities for foreign explorers and collectors. European archaeologists ruthlessly removed statues, ceremonial items, and even human remains, shipping them to museums in London, Paris, and Santiago. Some moai were deliberately cut at the base and taken whole, now displayed thousands of miles from their sacred homes. The island had, in essence, become a tragic case study in cultural erasure. But the Rapa Nui people never forgot who they were. Even in forced silence, they carried the memory of the moai. The traditions endured, hidden, whispered, passed down in fragments. And slowly, over the centuries, the people would begin to reclaim the profound stories carved in stone. But first, the world had to learn to listen. Reclaiming the Stones, Rapa Nui's cultural revival. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Rapa Nui embarked on a slow but determined process of cultural revival and reclamation. The moai, once toppled and buried by time, conflict, and neglect, were gradually raised again. This time, they stood not just as monuments of a lost past, but as powerful symbols of enduring resilience. In the 1950s, famed Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl brought significant international attention to Easter Island. Although many of his theories were flawed, particularly his ideas about South American influence, his work undeniably helped spark archaeological interest and global curiosity. Researchers from around the world descended upon the island, no longer to plunder as before, but to meticulously study and restore. Restoration efforts began in earnest. Fallen moai were carefully re-erected on their ahu platforms. Coral eyes were painstakingly reconstructed. Pukeo topknots were returned to their rightful place. The island's ancient roads, quarries, and ceremonial sites were meticulously mapped and studied. A clearer, more nuanced picture of the Rapa Nui civilization began to emerge, not one shrouded in impenetrable mystery, but one of remarkable engineering brilliance, profound spiritual depth, and intricate cultural complexity. But the most important voices were no longer solely those of foreign scholars. They were, decisively, the Rapa Nui people themselves. Descendants of the original builders began the arduous process of reclaiming their language, their ancestral rituals, and their land rights. In 2017, Chile formally transferred control of Rapa Nui National Park, which encompasses most of the island's crucial archaeological sites, back to the Rapa Nui community. Now, local islanders directly oversee the moai and their care, and critical decisions about excavation and preservation are made with profound cultural sensitivity and a deep well of ancestral knowledge. New generations are learning the stories of their ancestors, not just from academic textbooks, but from elders, through ancient chants, traditional dances, and the moai themselves. Efforts to decipher Rongorongo, the island's mysterious script, continue with cautious optimism, and global institutions, including the British Museum and the Louvre, face increasing pressure to return moai and other sacred artifacts taken during the colonial period. Today, Rapa Nui stands at a fascinating crossroads between preserving its cherished memory and navigating the complexities of modernity. Tourists arrive in waves, and economic development brings both opportunity and inherent risk. Yet, the people continue to fiercely protect their heritage, not as a frozen relic, but as a vibrant, living tradition. The moai no longer serve as silent guardians over a lost world. They now bear witness to extraordinary survival, to a culture that endured collapse, colonization, and systematic erasure, and still found a way to rise again. Stone cracked, forests burned, voices were silenced, but the ancestors still stand.